Thank you very much, Mr. Kakakhel, for granting this interview to Politics and Development magazine and Lead Pakistan. Sir, you have been with the United Nations Environment Program on a very responsible position for a long time. Please enlighten us that how international policies regarding environment, sustainable development are made. What are the imperatives behind it?
Well, the process for the formulation of global solutions to global environmental challenges began with the 1972 conference, and they reached a very high watermark in Rio during the uh, World Conference on Environment and Development, at which Agenda 21, which was the detailed plan of action for sustainable development, was agreed along with two conventions, the Convention on Biological Diversity and the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. As far as the process is concerned, basically the international rules and norms and agreements are reached by governments in the intergovernmental meetings. These meetings are organized under the auspices of the United Nations, and governments naturally consult various stockholders in their own countries. They also look at their national interests, their economic interests, their political ideals, and the various constraints that shape their policies. So international environmental policy making reflects the realities of the world at the time those meetings take place and those agreements are negotiated.
So naturally, the big powers must be making the policies, or in other words, imposing on weaker countries.
Well, as far as the global environmental issues are concerned, it was recognized right at the outset that global problems are such that national actions by countries within the national frontiers, are not adequate to resolving them. And that is why countries must cooperate. But when it comes to agreeing the terms of cooperation, naturally developing countries seek more assistance from the developed countries, and developed countries try to reduce their commitments to providing financial and other support because of their own political and economic constraints. Um, so that is how I wouldn't say policies are made by developed countries. Policies are made by the entire international community, which comprises both developed and developing countries. And if it was only the developed countries, they have their own institutions. You have the OECD, you have the European Union, you have the Group of 8 or the Group of 9, then they wouldn't need the United Nations. And those are groupings from which the developing countries are excluded. So I would say that the developed and developing countries work together or seek to work together to come up with agreements. Naturally, sometimes these agreements are not idealistic because they try to reflect the interests of both sides, the developed and the developing, or the North and the South.
So there is a criticism on United Nations here in Pakistan. It is a mistress of the United States. So how would you respond to that? United Nations in terms of environmental policy, like UNEP, is the, or let me also add that resolution on Iraq, United Nations Security Council didn't allow Bush to attack Iraq, but he disregarded and attacked Iraq. So how UN can play an effective role in terms of implementing the environmental policies?
I don't think the United Nations is subordinate to the U.S. Interests. You have in the United Nations other countries. You have China as a permanent member of the Security Council. You have Russia as a permanent member of the Security Council. And even the European members, Britain and France. I would call them the allies of the United States, but I wouldn't call them totally subordinate to the United States. Having said that, I would agree that the United Nations, as the grouping of the world nations, reflects the realities of the relationships between and among countries. If developing countries depend on developed countries for aid and assistance, naturally they cannot exercise the kind of influence that countries which do not need support from the United States, they have.
Don't you think that the agenda of sustainable development has more to do with moral commitment, voluntary commitments, voluntary action than an implementing force? What do you suggest?
This has
If
been,
policing is required or a moral conscience is needed?
this has been a problem with agreements and declarations on sustainable development. That these agreements do not have any strong enforcement authorities behind them. If you compare environmental agreements with the agreements that are reached under the World Trade Organization, the environmental agreements are seldom implemented fully, whereas the WTO agreements are implemented because there is a mechanism to enforce. Fines are imposed on countries which violate the agreements. There is an entire infrastructure for ensuring compliance with and enforcement of the global trade agreements. No such arrangement exists for environmental agreements. So you have to depend on the moral force or moral influence of the global agreements and on the essential common sense and logic that these agreements reflect.
And if you allow me to connect this question with another, is that the reason that Kyoto Protocol failed?
The Kyoto Protocol did not fail completely, but it failed significantly. Under the Kyoto Protocol, which was basically an executive plan meant to implement the Framework Convention that was signed in 1992. Developed countries agreed to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions by an average of 5. The agreement was not implemented fully because the United States, which was a signatory, could not ratify the agreement. In fact, it walked out of the protocol, thereby leaving the implementation, postponing the implementation by almost 7 years or so. The protocol was negotiated in '97. It should have come into effect within a couple of years, but because of the walking out of the United States, you could not get the reductions amounting to 50% of the global reductions, which is why the protocol came into effect in 2005 after Russia agreed to join in the implementation. The agreement was not implemented because developed countries found it difficult, either politically difficult or otherwise not feasible to slash their reductions. They had probably carried out maximum measures for reducing their emissions and were not prepared to sacrifice their lifestyles. You know, what does reducing emissions mean? Reducing emissions mean practically what the Pakistani nation is doing, load shedding.
Yes.
You have to reduce your use of energy. And that nobody is willing to do. Nobody wants to suffer. The difficulties that humanity suffered before the Industrial Revolution. People want to have comfortable, warm homes in winter and comfortable, cool homes in summer.
And sir, you just attended the Cancun conference and you just talked about the mindset of the developed countries. Did you see any change in their mindset now? Are they willing to change their lifestyle? Or do they still have the same mindset?
I think the inability of the developed countries to agree to effect deep cuts in their greenhouse gas emissions shows that they are unable or unwilling to make the sacrifices that are needed to save the planet uh, by and to bring about the stabilization of climate, which was the purpose of both the convention and the protocol and the conference that was held in Cancun. We did not see the kind of political commitment, the political will that is needed by these countries which are responsible for creating the problem of climate change in the first instance by their emissions over more than 200 years since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution.
So what will be the future of the world climate if there is no change in the mindset?
Well, this is exactly what the worries are after the Cancun agreements, because the Cancun agreements, according to the vision in the Bali plan, which was agreed 3 years ago in 2007, was that developed countries will slash their greenhouse gas emissions significantly and deeply, and that they would agree to something like 25 to 40% reductions, as was recommended by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. They have not done so. The commitments that they made, according to the best scenario, would amount to 16% emissions. This is according to UNEP, the organization that I worked for. They did a study of the commitments that developed countries made in Copenhagen last year. And the best scenario would be 16% reductions. The worst scenario will be a 6% increase in greenhouse gas emissions. That is nowhere. That's a far cry from the 25 to 40% emissions called for by the IPCC on the basis of solid scientific studies.